centers for mothers, child abortions for anyone who wants them.
From the Equal Pay Act to Title IX and the Women's Business Ownership Act, the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in the United States didn't just reshape policy. It rewired a national psychology, and 40 to 60 years later has led to unintended discrimination that no one will admit, and is still very much alive and well. The 1960s to 1980s, in fact, marked a shift from equal opportunity to institutionalized protection. That is, creating empathy and accountability lines that still divide genders today. This episode traces the origins of modern double standards, how the laws written to create gender equality in the 60s through the 80s quietly built the framework for the male discrimination that we live with today. In this episode, we'll move through 4 major pieces of early gender legislation step by step. What it established, what exceptions or promotional advantages it created rather than true equality, how those choices reshaped cultural expectations, and the psychological consequences that still define gender double standards today. And as we'll see, each law marks not just a policy shift, but a subtle transfer of moral weight, from equality of opportunity to selective protection and privilege. Between the 1960s and 1980s, the landmark laws that we'll review and some of their subsequent court decisions shifted the terrain of gender and law from overt exclusion to remedial inclusion. On the one hand, they achieved necessary progress in some ways. More women experienced increases in equal pay, education access, bodily autonomy, and business ownership. On the other hand, the legislations entrenched a particular structure of protection and exception. That is, women as a group needing remediation and men being established implicitly as the baseline or default. That framing helped establish the cultural scaffolding for many of the double standards that men are experiencing. For example, men are expected to behave, restrain, and provide. Women are expected to be protected, supported, and given special access or space. In psychological terms, the 4 laws we'll review helped cement roles. Women as recipients of special rights and protections, men as the normative default whose roles and responsibilities are assumed rather than assessed for society's best functional outcomes. And that structural backdrop makes later technological, institutional, and media shifts from the 90s onward more understandable, because they amplify a repurpose of a system that's already skewed by decades of legal framing. So let's start with the Equal Pay Act of 1963.
At the urging of Esther Peterson, President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act.
I must say I am a strong believer in equal pay for equal work, and I think that we ought to do better than we're doing.
In 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act, a milestone piece of legislation that made it the law of the land that men and women receive equal pay for equal work. However, 50 years later,
New friend green and a sneaky link. New friend green and a sneaky link. Fake 10 hands and a hoop.
Enacted in June 1963, this law amended the Fair Labor Standards Act with an intention to prohibit wage discrimination on the basis of sex. Men and women who perform substantially equal work in the same establishment must receive equal pay. One landmark case for this one is Corning Glass versus Brennan in 1974, which clarified that pay disparities rooted in sex-based job classifications violated the Equal Pay Act. The court ruled that employers could not justify lower pay for women simply because the work occurred on different shifts, setting the precedent that strengthened female wage claims and expanded federal interpretation of equal work. When the Equal Pay Act of 1963 was passed, the dominant narrative suggested that women were routinely being paid less than men for doing identical jobs. In reality, the data behind that claim was far more complicated. The average female worker did earn substantially less overall, reportedly about 60 cents on the dollar, but most of that gap reflected occupational segregation, not unequal pay for the same position and the same work.
To supply the conveniences for modern living, the products we create and build grow ever more complex. And in every supplier plant, each man and woman must work with a feeling of responsibility.
And this is the same misunderstanding that's promoted today. Supporters of equal pay cite industry incomes while failing to acknowledge differences in specific jobs. But back in the 1960s, in sectors where work was standardized and earnings were easily comparable, such as factories, clerical work, retail cashiers, and assembly lines, the evidence of outright unequal pay for identical roles was relatively rare in the early 1960s. Large employers with unionized or government-linked pay structures already used fixed wage scales that applied equally to men and women in the same role. The remaining gaps tended to arise from differences in shift assignments, that is, night versus day shifts, and maybe even physical labor differentials, all technically outside the narrow definition of equal work. Where real disparities did exist was in non-union or locally managed workplaces, especially small-town offices, hospitals, and schools, where pay setting was discretionary and informal. But even there, equal pay for equal work was less about identical job titles and roles and responsibilities than it was about comparative value. For example, male janitors earning more than female cleaners, or male clerks earning more than female typists, even though the work required similar skill and effort. Congress used those examples to make the case for this act, even though the national pattern was driven more by job clustering than by pay discrimination within the same role. While the Equal Pay Act established some protections for women against wage discrimination, there has never been an equivalent measure addressing the structural risks or disadvantages of men's work.
Being a coal shoveler was a tough and dangerous job. Workers had to shovel coal in tight spaces like mines and industrial boilers. This job required a lot of physical strength and stamina because shoveling coal was a never-ending and hard task. The coal dust was harmful, leading to serious health problems such as breathing issues and lung diseases, which made the job even more risky.
The policy logic of the era defined equality narrowly as correcting female underpayment, not accounting for male overexposure to risk or their economic disposability, thereby leaving men's physical labor effectively invisible in the equality debate. The effect of the Equal Pay Act on double standards is that, as one of the first major legal moves to so-called correct gender disparities, the act framed women as a group needing legal protection from male-dominated employment systems. In doing so, it subtly shifted the cultural baseline, such that men were assumed to have the standard pay and women required special enforcement. This then led the groundwork for a pattern in which men's economic roles are normative and women's deviations are framed as exceptions that need to be justified. The psychological consequence of the Equal Pay Act is that over time it contributed to what one might call the male standard versus female remediation mindset. Women's advancement became framed as needing special legislation rather than equal treatment, which reinforces the perception that women are in a secondary or corrective role.